So really it's talking about how do we avoid customs duty legally, right? And so there's really a few things. We have the duty avoidance side of life. So how do we just not pay it on the front end? And then we have the duty recovery side of life on, hey, we've already paid it, but I need to get it back. So on the duty avoidance side, we're talking about things like TIBs. We're talking about things, carnets, which a lot of people refer to as the passport for your freight, U.S. goods return tariffs, foreign trade agreements, specifically when you talk about potentially GSP, foreign trade zones, for sale rule. On the duty recovery side, duty drawback. And then you look at some of these new Section 232, Section 301, and how do they fit into both duty avoidance, and then if we didn't avoid it, can we at least recover it potentially at some point? So we're going to kind of get into this just right away. Like I said, I know this is a little bit different than how we usually do this, but there seem to be just a lot of questions coming in. So we're going to spend a good chunk of the time here talking about just some ways to maybe legally avoid duty. And one of the things that before we really even get into any of the strategies mentioned on the slide that you're looking at, there's one thing that we would be remiss if we didn't say, and that's a conversation around the actual classification of your goods. That's not really a duty avoidance strategy, but that is a compliance strategy that I think a lot of people maybe have just used their parts database, the tariff numbers assigned to their goods for an extended period of time. Maybe you came into a role that was passed down over time and you just continued to use it, but maybe it's a really good time to sit down and take a look with Section 232, with Section 301. There's a lot of opportunity to take a look at those tariffs and make sure that we're actually classifying them correctly to begin with. Because a lot of the times we've seen a lot of instances here recently where maybe we weren't classifying exactly correct. And then we get out of this whole conversation around duty avoidance and duty recovery simply with just a correct classification. So with that, we're going to get this kicked off on the TIBs. So just a couple of points here on the TIB in general and a couple of questions. And Pat, I'd be kind of interested to hear maybe some of your thoughts. But one of the things that I always like to remind people when we start talking about TIBs is that not everything qualifies. And I think this is really where we see most of our clients start to get in trouble, is that they anticipate bringing something in for a short amount of time, shipping it back out of the country, and they're like, I can just bring it in under a TIB and not have to worry about it. Well, inside of the tariff, we're looking at specifically Chapter 98, heading 9813. We're really getting into where the TIBs take hold, and there are a lot of instances where TIBs can be very, very advantageous for you, but at the end of the day, you have to make sure that it applies. And so, Pat, I don't know if you see maybe some of that, or if you can provide an example of sometimes where you see some of your clients using the TIB to kind of get around paying some of these duties legally, simply for the fact that they're only going to have it in the States for, let's say, 6 months, and then ship it back out.
Yeah, sure. That's a good, a TIB is a good alternative, especially if you can fit your goods in it. TIBs cover a lot of products for demonstration purposes. So if it's something that you don't plan on keeping here, there's also a provision, 9813.005, I believe. But it's the first one listed, where you can process raw materials or an article into a different product and export it within a year. Which is similar to an FTZ, but unlike an FTZ, there's a little less paperwork that goes into it. So TIBs are a great solution if you do qualify. I would encourage you to go through all of the 10 categories in 9813 to see if it's something that could apply to you. If not, there are solutions, there are alternatives though as well. I mentioned foreign trade zones. As well, there is manufacturing that can be done there. Goods can be stored there, and they can be shipped out without any duty being paid.
Well, and I really think it is, you just mentioned it as well. When we start to talk about that TIB and that option, is that there is some amount of processing that's okay that can be done here in the United States to then sell your item back out. Now, there's a lot of
And
caveats and catches to this, and I think maybe that specific heading catches a few folks off guard, but ultimately, there are significant ways that this can be used to avoid the amount of duty, or potentially not, or you're paying it but then having to go through the duty drawback process in order to get that money back when you could potentially not pay it at all. So I think that's a good way to kind of kick this off. There's a lot of small options around TIBs, but I think as a whole, it's an area that we have a majority of customers that are kind of afraid to sometimes take advantage of it because there's a lot of rules and regulations that surround that process. But ultimately, it's something that can be a very powerful tool in your toolbox of avoiding duties altogether.
right, and to the extent that you're importing goods and then exporting them back out, what you have to do to satisfy customs is show them exactly that you've imported the goods, you've traced them, and then you've traced them back out, which is all things you'd keep in the normal course anyway. So
right.
To the extent there's any trepidation about using this provision because it's complicated, it's not necessarily as complicated as you might think, because you'll just be using the records that you would keep in the normal course anyway, or your broker or forwarder would keep in the normal course.
Right. No, absolutely. And, I think something that leads us right on to that is the use of the carnet. And I think when a lot of people hear the word carnet, they immediately associate that word with export, right? It's a passport for goods. As your goods leave the country, it can traverse multiple different countries and come back to the U.S. and no duty was paid, not only here in the U.S., but abroad. But I don't think, and even if you talk to the U.S. government about the word carnet, we just gave a seminar on this a couple months ago, and they all started shaking their heads because when they introduced this to clients, to shippers, it's all about promoting export. And I would argue there's also a very big provision inside of this that allows you to avoid duty on the import side of life. Because not only can you work through the process of using that for export, if you're shipping something in for a short amount of time, you're talking tools of the trade, some trade show items that maybe you previously cleared just because it was simpler. There is an argument to use a carnet on some of those imports, but I really feel like it's an underutilized product in the duty avoidance toolbox that we don't even think about because everyone associates the word export when you talk about carnet. So, in those lights, Pat, I mean, you start to talk about carnets and I don't know if you've ever even talked to a customer much about using it on the import side, but all those conversations always tend to revolve around how do I use it to get this product out of the country and potentially then back in at a later date. And then we run into, the next topic, U.S. goods returned. But, do you agree that there's definitely that there's an argument to be used also on the import side?
Sure, absolutely. Especially, because the carnet is the entry document. It follows the goods into the country and it follows them out and there's no duty that attaches. But, it's similar to a TIB in the sense that not everything qualifies for a carnet.
Right.
So it's great if your product is eligible for a carnet. It's something you can use. But again, like TIBs, it's premised on you eventually shipping the goods out of the country, which not everybody can do.
Right.
But if you do, carnets and TIBs, if you qualify, are great options. But
no, absolutely.
Again, it doesn't apply to everybody. But if it applies to you, you can definitely use it to your advantage, and I would encourage you to do that.
No, absolutely, and I really think that we just don't think about it enough. But one thing that's a little different about the carnet as opposed to the TIB is that carnet has to be issued by the foreign government, assuming it's going to come in and go back out. So with the TIB, sometimes that decision's made in transit. You can't make the carnet decision in transit. It has to be made.
It has to be done beforehand, and you have to get it from the issuing authority. Right.
So just a quick catch there, because we have seen it before where this product's partway here, and our first question is, oh, is this coming in on a carnet? And it's usually, oh, what is that? And then at that point, we're already too late. So then we get into the paying of duty and then the backside of the duty recovery as it leaves the country. So, let's move on. So both of those are very simple ideas of ways that folks can maybe avoid just paying duty in general. And then we get into U.S. goods returned. And one thing that I want to call attention to specifically within U.S. goods returned, and then is, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, Pat, but I think it was maybe two or so years ago, there's a big change to that Chapter 9801 HTS, right? The description used to very clearly say U.S. goods returned, as in goods that were made in the United States, shipped abroad, and then came back in. And they made a change to the description there, and they added the words that it also includes goods that were previously imported with respect to which duty has been paid without the benefit of drawback. So basically what they're saying in there is that if you've imported an item from, let's say, China, at some point you have sent it back overseas because something needed to get done to it, as far as maybe there needs to be some repair work done overseas because you sent it back for warranty, or you've shipped it out of the country for something that didn't meet client spec, it's coming back in. With the new verbiage in there, you don't have to pay duties potentially on that stuff that's coming back in. And I think that's a big change that, you and I see each other a lot every year, and, at different national events. And I feel like this is a change in the tariff that went relatively unreported.
Yeah, it's funny how some of these things can fly under the radar, but you're right. I'm not sure. I don't recall seeing very many announcements about it other than the notice changing the tariff. Again, but like a lot of these things, it takes on a new importance with this trade war we're in. And It's not just a trade war with China. We're in a trade war with a lot of companies and commodities, for example, steel and aluminum. So things that might not have been that big of a deal several years ago now become such a big deal. Your products that you shipped out to China might have been duty-free when this was put into place. Now the provision is still duty. The products would still be duty-free, but now it's a 25% addition on top of it by virtue of going to China.
Right. And so I think, we've had these conversations before, and it was always one of those things that people, I don't think, they're like, it's just such a small amount of money that it's not worth maybe jumping through additional regulatory or compliance hoops in order to maybe take advantage of some of these. And as much as we like or don't like where we are tariff-wise, I do think Section 232, Section 301 has really opened the eyes to a lot of our importers that say, well, maybe now is a good time to take a look again, because just like you referred to, I was paying zero duties and now I'm paying 25%. I have a great example of a 232 client that during that time they imported steel, and the 2000, if you were to look at, let's say 2017 as a whole, I think they paid just shy of $100,000 in duties because it was all just fees. And then you turn around and you look at what 25% does to them, and it puts them in the $8 million range. And now all of a sudden you start to look at that and you say, how does that impact my bottom line? So,
and by the way, there's very little warning here. Sometimes orders are placed months or even a year in advance, and these tariffs came along fairly quickly, and people are left scrambling.
Right. A question just came in regards to 9801. So let's kind of talk through this. Here's the example, and I think this is where it's really hitting home, is that you have an item that you originally imported 2 years ago. 4 months ago, before Section 301 hit your product, you exported it because you needed something to get done. Now it has to come back into the U.S. the product maybe didn't meet spec, something happened. Are we paying 301 against that U.S. goods return tariff?
Yeah, ordinarily, without the use of 9801, if you imported that product and it's on one of the tariff codes that's hit by the applicable tariffs, you would have to pay. So 9801 might be a very good solution for you, where you'd have to pay for whatever repairs or additions you made to the product, or if there was none, duty free. That's what I would argue. And I think there is an FAQ out there where Customs says, with the exception of a handful of provisions in Chapter 98, it's all exempt from 301.
Correct. No, and so I think that's a large part. And because that flew under the radar, I don't feel like a lot of people even realize that is a viable option now, because it didn't really used to be. And it's not that it didn't used to, it just wasn't really publicized. And now we actually have the language in the tariff to really use this as another tool to bring things back in.
That's right.
So let's move on a little bit. Let's start talking a little bit about foreign trade agreements. We'll throw GSP in here as well. And I think what we're seeing, and I think where everyone's starting to get a little nervous is maybe the best word to use here, is that we have now GSP being removed from products that originate in India, and India turning around and putting retaliatory tariffs on things. We've seen this with Section 301. We issue, additional duties on things that are imported from China, and it turns around and we get retaliatory on the back end. And so, when you start to think about this, these become an important tool to look for opportunities to maybe source in a different light, but also to kind of always know in the back of your mind, especially when we talk about GSP, it has to continually get renewed. You look at something like NAFTA, or you look at something like CAFTA, those free trade agreements function a little differently in terms of just how they're written and how they work. So, when you start looking at free trade agreements, I would caution a few things when we start talking about using these as a tool for duty avoidance. And I guess the first thing I would caution is make sure the duty savings is worth the reward. And I don't know, I'm sure you've probably had this conversation a lot with clients, but I can't tell you the number of times someone says, I claim Australia free trade agreement every time something comes in, and we take a look and they saved $48 last year. And it's like, is that $48 worth the claiming and the amount of, compliance work and proof that has to go in? And, I don't think we have a number, but, to us, it really doesn't make good business sense to do this. And so I don't know if maybe you guys share a number, or if there's a number that even personally that you feel that says, at some point this is starting to get worth the risk.
I think that's a company by company consideration. There's big companies and small companies. $100,000 in savings might mean a lot to a smaller company, where it might not mean a lot to a very large, apparel importer. We deal with a lot of apparel companies. Because if you make the free trade claim or you make the GSP claim, you've got to be prepared to prove it if Customs asks. And there's a lot of record keeping that goes into it that Customs is going to expect to see to substantiate a claim. So, I can't give you a number that's going to work for everybody, because it's going to vary, but Adam's right. I wouldn't make this claim haphazardly. You're going to want to make sure you qualify beforehand and make sure your record keeping can prove it if asked by Customs or if you're audited. I also think a large part of the work we've been seeing recently with the Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs, more so 301, is moving production outside of China and creating a product that is no longer a product of China. For example, if you want to move production from China to Korea, the good has to undergo a substantial transformation. That's the term of art Customs will use when determining when raw materials of one country are manufactured in the second country. Now, if there's a company or there's a country that has a free trade agreement with the U.S., you can kind of kill two birds with one stone, because you're going to want to make sure that your good qualifies under that foreign trade agreement.
Right.
So you can get in there and make sure it qualifies, and chances are those operations that'll have to be done on the raw materials from China or any other country to meet that foreign trade agreement, you'll have a level of comfort that it also affects a substantial transformation. So you can guarantee that you qualify under the foreign trade agreement and you're not a product of China, making this thing totally duty-free. But the proof's always in the pudding. You got to make sure you can prove it.
Right. And I also think that, we've seen it in the past where someone maybe moves product from one free trade agreement country to another, but that doesn't mean that that product's still going to qualify. And a lot of people tend to take a one-size-fits-all approach, like, well, my product qualified for NAFTA, but now I'm going to actually make it in Korea because it just makes more sense. It's gonna qualify for the Korean Free Trade Agreement. All of a sudden, we're like, well, actually, no, it doesn't. And so,
because all free trade, foreign trade agreements, they're generally, a lot of them are different. I mean, they generally fall within two camps. One, a tariff shift camp, where goods have to undergo, non-originating goods have to undergo a tariff shift from one code to another to be considered an originating component and hence qualifying for the foreign trade agreement. Whereas other foreign trade agreements just define what an originating good is. And any non-originating components will have to pass that substantial transformation test, or in some cases, a double substantial transformation test.
right. So I think what you're saying, I know what I'm saying is it's a great way. Right. It's a great way to avoid duties, assuming that we do the due diligence on the front end to make sure our product actually qualifies.
That's right.
So, kind of along those same lines, let's talk first sale for a second.
Sure.
And you and I just had a long conversation with a client about the idea of using first sale. And I think it kind of goes into another one of those buckets that there's not a lot of conversation around the idea of first sale. So maybe real quick, Pat, why don't you give us just a real quick high level overview of what exactly first sale rule is, and then maybe you and I can dive into a couple of examples.
Sure. So the first sale rule is based in some court cases from, I think, the early 90s. And it's applicable in scenarios where there are multiple sales for export to the United States. For example, a lot of importers will place orders for merchandise with trading companies. They can be in any country. And then the trading company has a manufacturing arm. It's either a separate factory that the trading company owns, or in some cases, it's just the factory they have a relationship with, and they're not owned. But there'll be two sales there. The sale from the factory to the trading company, and then from the trading company to the importer. The first sale in that transaction is going to be for a lower value than the second sale, because the second sale is going to have that trading company's profit in it, its markup, where you can declare that first sale between the factory and the trading company without that markup and declare that value and play duty on that lower value, and in that way save money. It's a great program because it's not specific to any country. It will exist after these tariffs go away. So if you have a high duty rate or a moderate duty rate on any of your products, you can set up this program now to mitigate the effects of any 232 or 301 duties. And then when they go away, you'll still be realizing duty savings in perpetuity. That's the long and short of it. It does get complicated, especially if the trading company and the factory are related. Customs scrutinizes a little more transactions between parties that are related. They don't want people artificially creating values to declare to customs for purposes of saving duties. It has to be a legitimate value. It also can get complicated if the trading company provides any raw materials to the factory. But these are all issues that can be worked out. We've done it hundreds, if not thousands of times. And a lot of times companies will start saving money the day the program is set up and continue to do it until the program ends, if it ends.
No, absolutely. Like I said, it's a huge program. not enough people take advantage of it. There is some definite complexity there. So I wouldn't really recommend anybody just saying, hey, I think my product qualifies and just jumping into it. You know, talk to your broker, talk to outside counsel, talk to both, you know, figure out exactly what works and doesn't work. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on it because we have a whole mountain of 301 questions still floating around here. But, you know, just in general, it's a great way. And I think the example that we talked about, you know, with that potential client is they're importing an item into Canada for, let's say, $5, and they turn around and they're selling it into the US, you know, for 25, and paying 25% against that $5 import or 25% against that $25 import is the difference between having a successful business and putting them out of business. So, you know, I think people, when they think about this, need to think maybe a little bit larger picture here. And there are really some big opportunities for folks to save substantial funds on really when we start talking about 301 type duties.
And it's found money. I mean, you're not changing, if your supply chain's set up to take advantage of this and you're not taking advantage of it, it's just money sitting out there that you could be saving. You know, you'll have to put a little work into it to make sure everything's buttoned up, but it can be found money that you didn't have one day and then you have the next.
Right. And a lot of times it is simply that you spend a little bit, your return on investment a lot of times can come back in the first month or so. And then after that, it's all a brilliant investment. I'm going to skip foreign trade zones for now, because as we get into 232 and 301, I think we're going to hit on some different opportunities, you know, with them. And so we don't have a lot of 232 questions. So I'm really going to try to spend the last half hour or so here really focused on 301 and how to maybe tie in foreign trade zones, or in that case, how they don't tie in, right? And then what does duty drawback look like in some of those? So I think the elephant in the room right now, that let's get it off the table, is list 4. You and I were talking about this before we went live here, and I think you and I are of the same opinion that, you know, there's a big meeting coming up here at the G20, right? It's here in another week or so. We have our President Trump meeting with Chinese President Xi, and there's a lot riding on this. I mean, I think the stock market upon news yesterday rose 300 points in the first hour. So, you know, there's a lot riding on this. And so, you know, what's your take? Pull out your crystal ball, right? And say, what does this look like, do you think?
I think it's going to be similar to if you recall, a couple months ago now, the list 3 tariffs, right? They started at 10% and they were supposed to go to 25% 3 months later. But what happened was President Trump and President Xi met in Buenos Aires and they called a truce. And the 10% remained at the 10% until recently. I think you're going to get something similar here, because I think neither party, I should put it this way, each party is motivated to get something done. And I think if they can avoid going this extra step, if they can hang their hat on something, they'll do it. Conversely, if, you know, they speak and there's something that Trump absolutely can't live with, that you might go forward. But if I were a betting man, I would say that they'd probably call a truce. Now, I don't have any inside knowledge. I don't have a crystal ball, like Adam said, but that would be my guess. But you never know. If this president has proven anything, he's unpredictable.
No, absolutely. And I would agree with you 100% that this meeting is extremely important, not necessarily for tomorrow, but what does the next 30, 60, 90, 120 days look like with that potential list 4? I think you've already started to see some of the rhetoric maybe calm down a little bit, as far as there are going to be high-level talks even prior to the meetings next week between both sides. And I think we're hopefully headed in a direction that, you know, we don't, or at least we delay these for a significant amount of time. You know, we had testimony on the Hill yesterday where I think it was 47 companies and associations really sat down and talked through what does that look like to their business.
Yeah, and this list is different than any other list, really, right, for a couple of reasons. One, It has more consumer products on it than any other list. So, you know, on a daily basis, you may not have noticed the increase on your daily life on these other three lists. This one you will notice. So it's going to catch people's attention. And I think because of that, there's been such the comments filed and the comments made in public by U.S. companies have been more vociferous than they have been previously. So this list is different, I think. And not to mention, there's nothing left after this. I don't know what leverage, once we impose tariffs on everything, what leverage do we have left? We don't have another threat unless it's raising the tariffs even more.
Right.
From 25%.
No, absolutely. And I think that, you know, my hope in all reality is that, you know, whether you like the tariffs, don't like the tariffs, and, you know, I think out of the 47 or so companies that spoke yesterday, 2 actually spoke in favor of them. So, you know, I would say they're probably definitely the minority, and probably definitely the minority on this call today. But at the end of the day, you know, I think what this is really forcing people to do, whether you like the idea of them or not, is take a really hard look at their supply chain. You know, we talked about this for a long time when we started talking about CTPAT and the idea of going into that program. And where we see a lot of the benefit was not necessarily joining in, but getting ready and going through that really deep dive into your supply chain. And I think that's what these duties are really forcing everybody to do, is take a hard look at the supply chain and say, you know, where can I take advantage of something different? Can I move, sourcing somewhere else? Or what do my contracts look like for potential price increases for things that are out of my control? And I think we're seeing this stuff that maybe we either just hadn't thought about for a long time or took for granted. It is really all at the forefront of all of our minds. And how do we get beyond that?
We've been doing a lot of work of substantial transformation. People moving supply chains partially out of China to the extent they have to make their product a product of another country.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think it's, you know, I think it's massive. Another question here, specifically related to list 3. I know the dates were really fuzzy for everybody, right? We had first the 25% was happening, you know, June 1, but it had to have been shipped after May 10, and it got postponed to June 15. So there was a lot of confusion. I think the simple answer now is that, yes, you're paying 25%. We're after June 15th. We're on list 3.
That's right.
So at that point, you know, we are paying 25%, and, you know, there was a window in there. So
simple.
Go ahead.
It's simple now. Everything's 25%.
Right. Yeah, it's actually become a lot simple. So let's talk. So now that we have list 1 at 25, list 2 at 25, now list 3 at 25, you know, potential conversations about a list 4 at 25, we start to look at this and we say, you know, how can I get out of these? Let's talk about the exclusion process. Not only, we have a ton of questions that came in on the exclusion process. So, you know, for those of us who don't know, and then Pat, I'd be really interested in some of your kind of real life experience in doing some of these. But in general, the idea is that you're submitting to the government your product, and you're making a claim that because of a multitude of different reasons or potential different reasons that you can't buy this product here in the US, that China maybe is your only supplier because they're the only ones in the world who make said product, or so on and so forth. So, you know, that process is online, you know, list.
So,
go ahead.
So anyway, just a couple things about the exclusion process.
Yep.
So there's 3 lists so far, possibly a 4th list. Each list has its own particular exclusion docket. Mm-hmm. List 1 and list 2, the time frame to submit an exclusion is already passed. So it was they opened it up for 90 days. I think list 1
mm-hmm.
opportunity expired in the fall of last year, and list 2 it closed in December of last year, early January. But those are passed. You can't file any new exclusions on those
Right.
products. But what you can do is, as those exclusions are granted, they're open to everyone. They put those exclusions in Chapter 98 or 99, and if your product falls within that the description of that excluded product, you can just use that tariff code and you'll enter it duty-free. So I'd encourage you, if you are paying list 1 or list 2 duties, call your broker or look up the tariff itself and see if you fit within any of those exclusions. They're still going through list 1 exclusion requests. There were over 10,000 of them submitted. They've only answered about half of them. I think the approval rate was between 15 and 20%. They're very hard to come by. But if they are granted, they're made public and everyone can use them. List 3, there hadn't been an exclusion process until recently. Until that tariff went up to 25%, the government felt there was no need to offer exclusions on a case-by-case basis. Well, now it's gone up to 25%, and they've apparently changed their tune. Not to mention they have been getting a lot of heat from Congress. But in any event, they have promised to open up an exclusion docket for list 3 at the end of this month. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we've seen the exclusion form that must accompany all exclusions, and we can extrapolate based on list 1 and list 2, which were the same, what you'll have to hit on in these exclusion requests. In the notices for the list 1 and list 2 exclusions, they wanted you to at least touch on 3 things. 1, whether or not you could get this product outside of China. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. They also wanted you to hit on the economic harm it's causing to your company or to the larger industry or the U.S. as a whole. So, you may be able to concede a little bit that your product can be sourced elsewhere from China, but these duties are nonetheless causing such an economic problem for us and for our industry or for our region that an exclusion should still be granted. And the last thing they want you to touch on is whether or not the product you're requesting exclusion on is related to this China Made in 2025 initiative, which is an initiative started by the Chinese government years ago, where they wanted to become an industry leader in 10 key fields. They were all heavy tech fields, computers, telecommunications, where they want to be a leader. The U.S., they don't want China to lead in these industries. They want the U.S. to lead in these industries. So that's really where a lot of this animus is born from. But if your product is not related to these industries, you stand a much greater chance of getting an exclusion than if it is. So I think that's probably what the list 3 exclusion process is going to look like. I think you'll probably have a limited amount of time to get them in. The other ones, you had 90 days to submit all exclusions. If they were granted, they were retroactive to the beginning of the tariffs, and they were public. I think you're going to see a lot of that with the list 3 tariffs. I think the USTR also said yesterday in testimony that if there is a list 4 that goes into effect, there'll be an exclusion process for that as well.
Correct.
And I think that would be similar to list 1 and list 2.
So just to kind of recap that is, if your product was on list 1 or list 2, you have not filed an exclusion, you cannot. That process is closed.
You're out.
Then you look at list 3. And I think really the question here is, obviously there was an original March 17th date, right? That was the original date thrown out by Congress that said, hey, there has to be there has to be an exclusion process for 3. And now we're June 19th, right?
Right.
So you look at that, but I do think that based on what you're saying is that there's definitely work that can be done today to get ready for those list 3 exclusions. There's work that can be done internally at companies kind of preparing for that list 3 work, because as you said, it's a really tight window. The other thing that I wanted to draw attention to that you hit on is that a lot of these list 1 and list 2 exclusions are coming out as what I would call more general exclusions, which means that you didn't have to apply for the exclusion, but if the exclusion is granted, it's granted to everybody who imports said product. And that those do go back to the beginning of when this Section 301 process started. Now, there is a couple of catches in there because we're already, we've seen list one exist for long enough now that some of those entries are starting to liquidate. So we don't have the traditional method of going back and filing a post summary correction within the 314-ish day window, right? We're starting to look at, can we protest these? And I don't know if you guys have had any luck in that regard, because some of this stuff we have, we filed the entry in, let's say, December. We're obviously not to the liquidation window yet. The general exclusion comes out, and now we're able to go back and we're able to file those post summary corrections. So, and then get some folks some money back. But what about those entries filed, early July last year? We're past that PSC window. Those entries, if they haven't liquidated, are kind of in that last 20-day window of that 314 days that says you can't file a PSC. So we're waiting until liquidation to do anything. Have you seen or heard or had any success in protesting some of those early entries?
You do have to protest them to preserve your claim, because if the protest deadline, which is 180 days after liquidation, passes, and you get the exclusion but you haven't filed a protest, you're out of luck. There's nothing customs can do. They're bound by law. They can't refund the money. So
right.
You file protective protests, what they call them, and you say there's I import product ABC. There's an exclusion request pending with the USTR on this very product. We ask that you suspend review of this protest until the exclusion is either granted or denied. And then you have to follow up. But if you have that protest on the record and customs denies it anyway, you have a much stronger claim to bring to court. I don't think they'll deny it if you get that in, because they've come out and said in a message that they understand this problem, and they will accept protests that are kind of placeholders. So that's what you need to do. If you have a list one product that has a pending exclusion request, you need to start looking at the liquidation dates and then mapping out 6 months from there when the protest would be due if you want to get money back should the exclusion be granted.
Right. So, there's a lot that's going into this right now. I know, my brokerage teams that work across my office, we see these big general exclusions come out, run lists, and we have clients getting, high six-figure money back from these exclusions. But, make sure that, if your broker is not communicating that, is that, you as an importer are taking a good look at what exclusions did come out. Is there an opportunity to go back and get some of that money back? Because as you said, there's a lot of money on the table here. 25% against, $50, $200 billion worth of goods is a lot of money. And so we've had a lot of, folks take advantage of those.
Right. And the importer's kind of got to take the initiative here in a lot of cases, because maybe you took the position that, look, there's a 25% tariff, everybody's got to pay it, I'm just going to live with it. But then somebody in your industry files an exclusion request, and if they're successful, you're entitled to money back too. But your broker or whoever you're working with, may not know that you made that decision to not file an exclusion request. They're not going to know, or they're not going to be able to go out and they may not be able to go out and let you know, hey, look, an exclusion's been granted on this. I think the importers really got to take the initiative there. If they haven't communicated to the broker that this is something they're looking for, there's got to be that company initiative.
No, absolutely. So there's a lot, like we said, that goes into these exclusions. So I guess, at this point, there's really there's an approach on the importer side that says, hey, let's make sure that we are following these exclusions. Hopefully your broker's telling you if something comes out and your product applies, or that an exclusion applies, so that's definitely part of it. And then you have the next part, which is this preparatory work that says, our product is on list 3. We know there's no exclusion process yet, but we kind of can extrapolate where we need to go. And then the second side of that is, if you have an exclusion request filed for list 1 or list 2 that's just still sitting out there in pending status, is to make sure you're communicating with your broker or your own internal team or your outside counsel that says we need to file these, as you call them, protective protests, to kind of leave that entry open so we can go ahead and, if that gets approved, able to go back and get those funds back.
That's right.
So kind of along the same lines, why hopefully everyone can try to digest everything that we just walked through. I know it's kind of a big topic, and it is a legal question, so I will let the legal expert answer, but I think it's going to be pretty simple. And it says, in regards to Section 301 tariffs, is it legal to renegotiate my pricing now with my supplier?
Yeah, going forward, it is. Absolutely. You can renegotiate your pricing.
Right. No, absolutely. And so, there's nothing, I think there's a lot of conversations with some people, and they get into this, well, is it going to throw up a red flag? And I think that's a different conversation than, is it legal? It's absolutely legal. You can renegotiate your pricing based on whatever business decisions and discussions you have with your supplier, completely outside of a customs.
Yeah, they can give you, they give you a discount. You can claim that discount. You can take the discount and you can declare the discounted value. That's perfectly fine.
Right. No, absolutely. Kind of going along those same lines, and there's a lot of questions on here. I'm kind of working through my 3 pages here, but talk about just what exclusions, if we specifically talk about the exclusions that maybe you guys filed for list 1 and list 2, how successful do you think that you've been, your clients have been? Do you see any kind of big red flags as people look to start doing this preparatory work that you and I just talked about working on for list 3? Where have you seen maybe some pitfalls, and where have you seen a lot of success?
The ones that have been successful, to a certain extent, you've got to have a compelling story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's a case where it's just a hard case to win, and there's not much you can do. But the ones that have been successful, in my experience, have been ones where a couple of things. You can demonstrate a reason why this product has to be made in China. For example, perhaps the factory you're working with has been certified by a third-party certification company like UL. Those certifications take a long time and a lot of money to get, and not every factory has them. So it may be that you can get that product outside of China, but that factory outside of China is not certified by UL. That's one consideration. Another consideration is if you've got supply contracts that stretch out over years that have been finalized and there's no out provision, they were entered into before these Section 301 investigations took place, that's a very compelling fact. Another compelling fact is there are some products, I'm thinking, products that are painted, there's paint or some sort of chemical involved that can't be used in the United States or can't be used in production in the United States because of EPA regulations. Mm-hmm. But it can only be done in China. That's a compelling fact. Also, if you have government contracts, or if your contracts are with local governments, or if your contracts are for nonprofits, this is not what the government wants to hit. So if you have that type of information, you can bring that to the fore. That's very compelling.
Good. Well, I appreciate that. And, we get those questions all the time. Like, what do you think our chances of getting it are going to be? And it's such a hard question to answer.
One caveat I'll also add is that the ones that I've seen granted tend to be very specific. Because one big part of this is, what harm is it causing your company? Companies that will file these exclusion requests and say, well, our costs are going to go up, it's going to be expensive, we're going to lose customers, we're going to have to fire people. That all may be true, but you really have to make a solid demonstration of it. You've got to break out your financials. You've got to show them, hey, look, this is what we made in 2017, this is what we made in 2018, this is what we project for 2019. As you can see, it's an X% decline. That can be submitted confidentially. There's a confidential aspect of it. Companies that tend to be more specific and have more analysis tend to have done better than companies who just live in generalities. Because, yeah, it's true. Your costs increase, your profit's going to go down. But everybody's saying that. So I'd encourage you to be specific. Be as specific as you can.
Well, and I think that applies to a lot of the times you deal with customs in a lot of areas, right?
Definitely.
Is that we really get into the weeds of what we're talking about, try to leave the periphery away and just get really focused. So, we've been talking a lot about 301. We haven't talked a ton about 232, but I kind of want to bring it up in regards to, let's talk just a real quick snippet with, you got 301, 232 on foreign trade zones. Both of those items have said, or both of the announcements have basically said, is that we're paying that 301 almost no matter what, right? You can't really use the foreign trade zone to offset that. Now, what was interesting is some of that 232 that just went away in regards to Mexico, right? Is that what just came out? Is well, maybe there is some opportunity to now not pay that, and it was almost I don't know, luck of the draw than it was anything at that point.
Right. I don't know. As the Mexican I don't know that the Mexican deal has been finalized yet, has it?
Correct.
Right. But in any event, to Adam's point, so these for people that haven't worked with foreign trade zones, you've got to designate the goods as a certain status before they go in.
Right.
You've got to give them either non-privileged foreign status or privileged foreign status, and that designation, or zone prohibited status, that designation dictates whether or not they can be removed from the foreign trade zone into the U.S. and what duty you'll pay. The way these laws are written, the 232 and the 301 laws, is that the designation you give to the goods when they go in the zone ties them to the 232 and the 301 duties. You can't beat the clock. You can't put them in there and then wait to take them out until these duties go away. They've gamed the system against you. You can't do that.
Right. Yeah. You're sticking those goods in privileged foreign status, which means you're kind of locking in that duty rate as the goods go into the zone. So in that scenario, we're out of luck. A lot of people have brought that up and said, oh, I'm set up for a zone, but I haven't quite used it yet. I'm going to start now. And it's like, well, it's not really going to benefit the way you think it's going to benefit. Now, there are some other things that I don't think we probably have time to talk about as far as what those zones look like. I just wanted to bring up both like 232 and 301 in that conversation. Let's kind of keep on those same things. Let's talk about duty drawback. We've imported these goods. We're not getting an exclusion. We tried. Our product got denied. You're importing these things, but you're turning around and you export half of it just in the normal course of your business. When we start to look at, man, I just spent all this money. What can I get back? How does that work?
So it's fairly straightforward. You cannot claim drawback on 232 duties. They won't give them to you, but you can on 301. So if you bring in a product from China, you don't use it or you don't use all of it, and you send it back out, you can reclaim that duty you paid when it came in. Unfortunately, you can't do that with 232. They just said they're not going to process those claims. Right,
and if I believe I'm correct, I saw a statement the other day that said it's the first time in history that there's been any kind of announcement like that removed the privilege of drawback for anything that was imported that then was subsequently exported after manufacturing or anything else like that was done. One of the questions that we get asked a lot is, when do you think it's beneficial? And I really think that comes down to the conversation of, the individual business decision, right? Just like you talked about with the foreign trade agreements, when does, do you have a number in your head? We kind of pass out one. So I was just curious if you pass out a number that said, at some point this program becomes beneficial and then exponentially beneficial, but at what point is do you have a number in your head that says if you're not getting this much back, it's maybe not worth going through it all?
On drawback?
Yeah.
No, it's the same thing. I don't really have a number there. I wish I did. It'd be a little simpler, but it's really a company by company thing. Drawback, to the extent that you're already importing and exporting, you have the documents you need, or you should have the documents you need to make these claims.
Right.
Which is a little different than a foreign trade agreement. Because in a foreign trade agreement, you might have to get that manufacturing facility to start making records they might not otherwise make. Drawback, you've got to import and you've got to export them. That creates a paper trail, which is a large part of what you need. You also need some inventory records, which you may already keep. But drawback's a little simpler to set up. So I think the number would be a little lower. But just keep in mind that the bigger your drawback program, the more money you're getting back, the more work that needs to go into it. So those are two kind of dueling considerations you have to make when you're thinking about a drawback program.
Right. And with drawback, there is going for, sending in the application for privileges, to potentially get away from some of that, all as much paperwork as required as far as just protecting that export with the 53, and then filing the claim thereafter. So, with 301, we've seen a lot of folks come to us and say, hey, I used to export this. It was maybe 20, 30 grand a year worth of duties. Now we're looking at 400,000 a year. We want to go after that. And so a couple of points there is that you can only get up to 99% of those fees back. The government's going to keep one just for holding on to your money and then processing the claim back to you. So just know that going in, and then you start to look at, are you paying outside assistance to handle that, whether it's counsel, broker, a lot of times those are charged at, sometimes they're charged at percentages of the amount of money that's able to be returned. Sometimes there's flat fees involved. And so, make sure you kind of work through that program with whoever you're going to use and really understand the amount that you're going to get back. And it's not as simple as just saying, well, I know I imported this stuff last year and I turned around and I exported it. It is more involved than that. I do think it's records that you would keep in the ordinary course of business. But I think where we see a lot of people start to miss on this is they're not really looking to tie the import record back out to the export record, right? They're just saying, yeah, I know I imported this product sometime last year. I don't even necessarily know what entry it came in on, and now I exported it. And I think that's where we see a lot of people maybe start to fall down on their ability to get into and really start to recover and use this program well. Going along those lines, there's a question here that says, when you file and you get money back, are the refunds sent to the importer directly, or are they sent to, we'll just call it the filer, whether it's the broker, outside counsel, whoever it may be?
Is that for me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think you have to fill it out. I think you fill out who it goes to. I think it'll go to the claimant, not necessarily the importer, but I think there's a section where you can put the filer as the person who received the checks. But I don't file very many drawback claims. I don't know if you do, Adam, but that's, I think, how it works.
We do. We file a substantial number. We've gone from doing drawback as just part of our regular business to actually having full-time staff now that's all they do. Just because with all the 301 stuff that's out there, it's become very advantageous for a lot of companies to take advantage of that. And something that we always get into and something that we always caution is that these first few claims, before you start to look at applying for privileges, before you look at that, sometimes those can take a multitude of years to get that first check back. And I always warn people because they're like, it's $100,000. I'm going to get it back. And I don't think people, the government, when you start talking about customs and refunding you money, it's kind of like the IRS, right? They're really good at taking it. They're not necessarily so good at giving it back. And so
Absolutely.
It takes time and it takes energy, and just know that going into the process is that, this is something that is found money at some point, but at the end of the day, it does take time to get back to it. So we are actually a couple of minutes over time. And I know we didn't get to everybody's questions. We will go through and make sure everybody's questions get answered. I know I got 4 or 5 questions here open that I didn't get answered, plus probably another page and a half here or so as well. But Pat, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, and listen, I'm sure you'll feel the same way, but our emails are in this PowerPoint.
Absolutely.
Anybody has any other questions, feel free to email me, and I'm sure Adam feels the same way.
No, absolutely. We actually, on the bottom of this slide, we have our consulting email address. It's just kind of a general one if you have a general
There you go.
question. I think you and I have had some conversations after we've had some conversations with clients that said, hey, maybe outside counsel is the best way to go, and getting them over to you as well. So with that, I'm going to sign off. We will get this sent out to as many. We will get the recording sent out to everyone. We'll also send out a full presentation as far as, maybe some more definitions on what some of these strategies look like, just so everyone has it. So thanks again. And Pat, I'll see you soon.
Sounds good, Adam. Take it easy, everybody.